Hello, everyone. I want to thank you so much for joining us for this online resource for Transformative Expectations, harvesting the power of the power of choice. And today for this resource, I'm so honored to have Dr. Janee Steele. And I'm going to let Dr. Steele introduce herself, and then we'll jump right into everything she has to share for us today.
All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to share in this talk with you today. My name is Dr. Janee Steele. I am a licensed professional counselor in private practice in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where I am the owner of Kalamazoo Cognitive and Behavioral Therapy, which means that as a therapist, I practice primarily from a cognitive behavioral perspective. In addition to my work in private practice, I am also a counselor educator at Walden University, where I teach master's and doctoral level counseling students in clinical mental health and school counseling programs. I myself have a background in school counseling. My master's degree was in school counseling, and then I worked some as a school counselor at the middle school level, which if anyone is at the middle school level or has experience there, I'm sure they can understand the look of joy at my face that I'm not doing that anymore. Middle schoolers are great, but they're a tough population to work with. In addition to my experience working in schools as a school counselor, I also did my bachelor's degree in elementary education, and I have knowledge of K-12 public school systems through that as well.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Steele, for sharing your extensive background and your joy for what you do. So, we're going to jump right in because in Transformative Expectations, what we're doing is we are equipping teachers with tools they can use as we move forward during this school year with COVID, because we're still somewhat traumatized. And if anyone's like me, we had another case of COVID at my school this week
Mhm.
at the time of this recording. So you're going to share a little bit about the importance for us as educators managing our emotions. And then when you do that, if you could share one or two strategies that we can use for ourselves and actually teach our students.
Yeah. So, I think it's really interesting that you use the word trauma, um, because I think it so aptly describes what a lot of us are experiencing as a result of this pandemic, both as adults and children. And, from a clinical perspective, we know that whenever an individual has experienced some trauma, it means that some stress was introduced into their life that produced um, somewhat of an evolutionary response to protect themselves from that experience, right? So trauma occurs when something happens either too fast, too soon, or it's too much. And as a result of that, our brain kind of goes into survival mode, shuts down the rational thinking areas of our brains, and our they're called reptilian and mammalian parts of our brains kind of kick in, and so that's where that fight flight response or faint response comes in, right? And so if we're teachers or even if we're students, we might be dealing with some of that. For students who have been gone essentially from school for a year, being back in the school building, being in the school environment may be somewhat of a traumatic experience because there are all of these new expectations that they're unfamiliar with, that they're uncertain that they can meet. And so some of the behavior that we might be seeing in schools might be as a result of that trauma. So then when we think about managing emotions, an important first part to keep in mind when we're working with ourselves and when we're working with our students is that some of the behavior that the students are exhibiting might not be intentional. It might be part of their trauma response to being in this situation and not really being able to fully process it. So, as the adult, it can be helpful to take a step back, to not personalize the behavior, and to, recognize that this might be an involuntary response on the child's part to some extent. And so, as the adult, it can help us to manage our own emotions if we're not personalizing it, because when we do personalize it, then that puts us kind of in a fight mode where we want to come down on the student, or respond out of our own desires to protect ourselves. So from an adult perspective, not personalizing it, but then just going back to that trauma perspective, doing things that are going to calm, right? That are going to calm and settle us. And so you and I talked previously about breathing and how that's typically our go-to technique for settling, for managing anxiety, really just for kind of centering ourselves in preparing ourselves to take a mindful approach to what it is that we're doing. In the time of COVID, breathing might not be the preferred modality that we go to initially. So breathing is recommended because it is really effective, right? Like it helps to center us, it helps to introduce oxygen into the body, it helps to kind of interrupt those brain reactions that are occurring in response to trauma. So as much as we can, I do encourage us all to continue with our breathing practices. For some people, that might be a little bit more difficult if they're wearing a mask. And so if that's the case, if you or your students are finding deep breathing difficult because of the mask, I would encourage you to continue to offer that as a solution, focusing less on the deep aspect of the breathing and more of the rhythmic and concentrated focus that breathing introduces into our mind. And so in a classroom setting, something called square breathing can be really helpful because there's a visual that goes along with it. And basically all it is a square broken into 4 squares on the inside of the square. So kind of like a handball court maybe. And step 1 is hold in for 4. Step 2 is breathe out for 4. Step 3 is hold in for 4. Step 4 is breathe out for 4. And you can repeat it. And so it doesn't require you to breathe deeply because we're breathing anyway under those masks, right? So really it's just about counting and being focused on our breath. And again, that's going to slow us down. That's going to help redirect our attention. And it's going to get us to a place where we're better able to concentrate and do what it is that we need to do. The really cool thing about square breathing too is because there's that visual aspect of it, you can create an actual sign that you post in your classroom, and you can do this together as a large group to start your day or maybe start an activity. But if you see students struggle, you can also simply point to the visual on the wall and encourage them to do that. So that's one technique for calming, for settling ourselves. Another thing that we can do to help ourselves and to help our students, again, is to do things like humming or rocking. So these things also produce a very similar calming effect on our body, in our brains, because of the rhythmic motions and the concentrated focus on what we're doing. So if you want to spend time at the beginning of your day, where you offer your students the space just to kind of maybe think about the day, to rock back and forth, to think about something that calms them, to think about a place where they feel safe, to think about themselves succeeding, that can also have a very similar effect that breathing would have if it just doesn't feel feasible to practice breathing in your classroom space at this point in time. Outside of calming, there are also things that we can do to kind of be intentional about eliciting the type of behavior that we're hoping to see from students. The first thing is visualization. So just encouraging your students to spend time visualizing themselves being successful in whatever target behavior you've identified for them. So if they're anxious because there's a test coming up, provide time and maybe use some guided imagery to help your students visualize doing well on the test. If they're just having a rambunctious day, you might want to ask them to close their eyes and visualize themselves sitting in their seats, following directions, being a successful student in that way. And so visualization is another technique that you might think about using along with developing a class mantra. Again, mantras have the effect of autosuggestion, right? So when we say something about ourselves out loud long enough, we start to believe it. And so if you've developed some type of class mantra that reflects the type of character or behavior you hope to see in your students, eventually, if the student's not living up to that expectation, that the brain is going to experience that as a conflict, and it's going to automatically begin to readjust the behavior to fit that self-perception that they have of themselves. And so a mantra, I think, would be a final strategy that I would suggest for anyone looking to manage emotions in this time that we have right now.
Well, I want to thank you for suggesting all of those strategies. I know that I talk about, and mindfulness talks about statements of affirmation.
Mm-hmm.
So to have a personal statement that harvests a person's power of choice. But sometimes we may have to guide students through that if they don't have that experience before we meet them, and especially if it's not being reinforced outside of school. And
Yes.
then I love the fact that you said use visualization, and you used another term when you first started speaking about having. I'm used to graphic organizers. That's how we organize words. But
Mm-hmm.
what was that term that you use when it comes to, having a vision for ourselves? What was that term that you used?
Oh, I'm not sure what it is that
Well,
I said.
what I think it is a strategy to help students, because sometimes we have to, as educators, plant that vision or model that,
Mm-hmm.
especially for our younger students, or especially as you or we talked about those students who have been traumatized,
Mm-hmm.
because sometimes that vision that of their future is blocked due to the trauma. Because one thing trauma also does, or is an interruption, and sometimes when we're interrupted, it's hard to get back to
Mm-hmm.
where we're going. And sometimes we can't get back and we have to make a new vision. And that's something that we can do. But having the choice to decide on a class mantra and having input about that,
Mm-hmm.
that's harvesting the class as in their power of choice. And that mantra, does it have to stay at the same, or can it change? Can it be an overall theme and maybe change once a month? Or should it be static, or does it depend on the class itself?
It would depend on the class itself. You want to make sure you stick with it long enough to start to see some effect.
Okay.
So, yeah, if your mantra is stating something that you're not really seeing played out in real life with your students, you might want to stick with it, or you might want to revisit it to see how strong the belief in the mantra is on the part of the students. And so that might be an issue. And if that's an issue, if it's not something that the students really see for themselves, then you might want to think about developing a new one that's more authentic to what their experience is at this time in their lives.
Wonderful. So, Dr. Steele, thank you so much for your time, your energy, your expertise is phenomenal. So I hope the teachers who view this will be able to employ one or two of your strategies and be able to do so in a way that's positive for themselves as educators and
Mhm.
for their students. So thank you so much again for your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me.
My pleasure. Take care, everyone.